An officer on patrol during a calm, breezy evening never expected his routine duties to take such a dramatic turn. Officer Daniels, a young man known for his dedication to the badge and a firm belief in upholding order, found himself at the center of an incident that would change the way he saw his role in the community forever. It started as a seemingly small, insignificant moment. The consequences were anything but. As he drove his patrol car through the quiet streets, he noticed something unusual at the corner of a small park. An elderly woman, frail and hunched, was leaning against a bench, clutching her chest. From his training, Daniels recognized the signs of distress. She was struggling to breathe, her face pale and desperate. He quickly stopped the car and rushed over to assist. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Daniels asked, his voice firm, yet filled with concern. The woman couldn't speak, only pointing shakily at a small inhaler that had fallen to the ground just out of her reach. Without thinking, Daniels picked it up. But something in his mind, almost instinctively, paused him for just a fraction of a second. Was the device safe? Had it been tampered with? His duties as a law enforcement officer required him to assess every situation carefully. He hesitated, examining the inhaler for a brief moment, and then asked her, "Is this yours?" The woman tried to nod, her lips trembling as she gasped for air, but her response was weak and uncertain. The scene drew the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps to watch, their eyes darting between the officer and the struggling woman. It wasn't long before Daniels made the split-second decision to hold onto the inhaler rather than return it immediately. "I'm going to help you, but I need to make sure everything is safe first," he said, attempting to maintain his composure. He reached for his radio to call for medical assistance, his voice calm but firm, detailing the situation and requesting backup. But the woman's reaction to his hesitation was unexpected. Her eyes, which were filled with a mix of pain and desperation, suddenly darkened with something else, something like fear or urgency. She raised a trembling hand, attempting to pull herself closer to him, and whispered through shallow breaths, "Please, I need it. You don't understand." Daniels was taken aback. His instincts told him something more was going on here. He scanned her face, looking for any clues, and then down at the inhaler again. It looked ordinary enough, but the way she clung to her words gave him pause. "Why don't I understand?" "Ma'am, I'm trying to help you," he said, kneeling beside her. Her frail hands trembled as she tried to grab his sleeve. She managed to choke out a few more words, each one laced with panic. "My son, you'll regret it if you—" But before she could finish, her voice broke off, replaced by another ragged gasp. Daniels's heart pounded. Who was her son? And why would helping her, or not helping her, lead to regret? The mystery began to unfold in his mind like a puzzle he didn't have the pieces for yet. He felt the weight of the inhaler in his hand and the stares of the growing crowd around him. This was no longer a simple case of medical distress. In that moment, Daniels knew he was dealing with something far bigger than he had anticipated. He glanced at the elderly woman, her eyes pleading with him, and then back at the device. Should he trust his instincts or follow protocol to the letter? And what secret was she hiding that could be so important? Little did he know the answer to those questions would send shockwaves through his life and career. And when he finally discovered who her son was, everything would change. As Officer Daniels knelt by the struggling woman, time seemed to stretch. The weight of her cryptic words hung in the air, pressing down on him as heavily as the tension surrounding them. He clutched the inhaler tightly, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this woman? Why was she so desperate, and what did her son have to do with any of this? Her words, faint as they were, felt more like a warning than a plea. He scanned the park again, now hyper-aware of his surroundings. A handful of onlookers lingered nearby, whispering among themselves, but making no moves to intervene. Daniels could feel their stares burning into him, each one silently questioning his actions. Was he doing the right thing? Should he have just handed the inhaler back without hesitation? But it wasn't his nature to act on impulse, especially when something didn't feel right. The woman's labored breathing pulled his focus back to her. Her fragile frame trembled, her eyes darting between the inhaler in his hand and his face. There was something in her expression, fear mixed with urgency, that he couldn't ignore. "Man, an ambulance is on its way," Daniels reassured her, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "But I need you to tell me what's going on. Who is your son? Why would I regret not helping you?" The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Then, with great effort, she managed to whisper, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Before Daniels could ask what she meant, the sound of a car door slamming nearby startled him. He turned to see a sleek black sedan parked just across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. A man stepped out, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his movements deliberate and controlled. Daniel's instincts kicked in. There was something about the man's presence that set him on edge. He moved with the confidence of someone who was used to being in charge, someone who expected the world to bend to his will. The man's eyes locked onto the scene in the park, narrowing as they settled on the elderly woman and the officer beside her. "Is there a problem here?" The man called out, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. He began walking toward them, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Daniel stood, instinctively placing himself between the woman and the approaching man. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone professional but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced down at the woman, who was now visibly trembling. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and she shook her head weakly as if trying to say something, but no words came out. Finally, the man spoke, his voice steady and cold. "You got something that doesn't belong to you, officer." Daniel's grip on the inhaler tightened. "This belongs to her," he said, nodding toward the woman. "She's in distress. You know her." A flicker of something, anger, frustration, crossed the man's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I know exactly who she is," he said, his tone clipped. "And I also know you're making a mistake by getting involved in something you don't understand." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken tension. Daniels could feel his pulse quicken, but he stood his ground. "If you know her, then maybe you can help explain why she's in this condition," he said, gesturing toward the woman, "and why she mentioned her son like it was some kind of threat." The man's jaw tightened, his composure slipping for just a moment. "Her son," he repeated, almost mockingly. Of course she'd bring him up. Daniels didn't like the tone in his voice. "Who is he?" he pressed. The man took a step closer, lowering his voice so only Daniels could hear. "He's someone you don't want to cross. Trust me on that." Daniels didn't flinch. "I'm just trying to help her," he said, keeping his tone measured. "If there's something I should know, now's the time to tell me." The man stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he let out a short, bitter laugh. "You really have no idea what you've stepped into, do you?" he said, shaking his head. Before Daniels could respond, the faint sound of sirens reached his ears. The ambulance was getting closer. The man straightened, his demeanor shifting back to one of calm control. "This isn't over," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Daniels watched as the black sedan pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the night. He turned back to the woman, who was now slumped against the bench, her strength fading. He knelt beside her again, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Help is almost here," he said softly. "But I need you to tell me what's going on. Who was that man? And who is your son?" The woman's lips moved, but her voice was barely audible. Daniels leaned in closer, straining to hear her. "You don't understand," she whispered, her breath shallow. "He's powerful, dangerous." "Who is?" Daniels asked, his patience wearing thin. "Your son, that man." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes fluttered close, and for a terrifying moment, Daniels thought she might lose consciousness. But then she opened them again, locking her gaze onto his. "My son," she said, her voice trembling. He's not what you think. None of this is." The sirens grew louder, and within moments, the ambulance pulled up to the scene. Paramedics rushed out, their movements efficient as they assessed the woman's condition and prepared to transport her. Daniels stepped back to give them space, his mind still racing with questions. As the woman was loaded onto the stretcher, she reached out, grabbing his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes bore into his, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Be careful," she whispered. "They'll come for you too." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. Before he could ask what she meant, the paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance and closed the doors. He watched as the vehicle sped off, its lights flashing in the darkness. Standing alone in the now empty park, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Officer Daniels stood motionless for a long moment, the echoes of the ambulance siren fading into the night. The old woman's warning lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. "They'll come for you too." What had she meant? Who were asterisk the asterisk? And what kind of power did her son possess that could inspire such fear in her, and now in him? His radio crackled, pulling him back to the present. It was dispatch, asking for a status update on his location. Daniels hesitated, unsure how much to share. The encounter felt strange, almost personal, and he wasn't ready to explain it to anyone, not yet. After a brief pause, he responded with a vague summary, saying he had assisted an elderly woman in distress, and that paramedics had taken over. It was technically true, but it didn't even begin to capture the complexity of what had just happened. Back in his patrol car, Daniels replayed the events in his mind. The cryptic words, the man in the black sedan, the tension that seemed to hang in the air. It all pointed to something much bigger than a routine medical emergency. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled into a situation that was about to spiral out of control. The quiet hum of his car's engine did little to ease his nerves as he drove back toward the station. As he turned onto a familiar stretch of road, his mind wandered to the inhaler. It was still in his pocket, forgotten in the chaos of the moment. Pulling over to the side of the road, he retrieved it and examined it more closely. It looked ordinary enough, but something about it felt off. The woman's desperation to have it, paired with her son's apparent influence, made him wonder if it was more than what it seemed. Daniels turned the device over in his hands, noticing faint scratches near the base as if it had been tampered with. A part of him wanted to take it to the station and hand it over to forensics, but another part, the part driven by instinct, told him to hold on to it. If the situation was as sensitive as it felt, trusting the wrong person could be a mistake. The next morning, after a restless night, Daniels decided to dig deeper. He started with a simple search, combing through public records to see if he could identify the woman or her son. He didn't have much to go on, just her appearance and the vague mention of a son with significant influence. But as he searched, his frustration grew. Whoever they were, they didn't leave much of a public trail. His phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was a text from his friend and colleague, Officer Morgan. "You okay? Heard you had a weird one last night." Daniels frowned. News traveled fast in the department. He debated how to respond, ultimately settling on a vague reply. "Yeah, still figuring it out. Nothing major." He wasn't ready to share the full story, not even with Morgan, who he trusted more than most. Later that day, Daniels decided to return to the park where he had first encountered the woman. He needed to see if there were any clues he might have missed in the chaos. As he walked along the path, his eyes scanned the ground, the benches, the surrounding area. Everything seemed ordinary, too ordinary. It was as if the scene had been scrubbed clean of any trace of the incident. A sense of unease crept over him as he noticed a man sitting on a nearby bench, reading a newspaper. The man was dressed casually, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. He seemed too focused on blending in, his eyes darting up every so often to glance at Daniels. Was he watching him? Or was Daniels just being paranoid? As Daniels approached, the man folded his newspaper and stood, walking away briskly. Daniels considered following him, but decided against it. Without any concrete reason to suspect him, it could create more trouble than it was worth. Still, the encounter left him feeling unsettled. That evening, Daniels received an unexpected call on his personal phone. The number was blocked. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "This is Daniels," he said cautiously. There was a pause on the other end before a deep, measured voice spoke. "Officer, you've involved yourself in something you shouldn't have." Daniels' grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" "That's not important," the voice replied. "What's important is that you walk away. Forget about the woman. Forget about her son. And most importantly, forget about the inhaler." Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease creeping in. The voice let out a soft chuckle. "You're a smart man, officer. Don't make me regret giving you this warning." Before Daniels could respond, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, his mind racing. Whoever was on the other end knew too much. About him, about the incident, about the inhaler. This wasn't a coincidence. Determined to find answers, Daniels decided to call in a favor from an old contact, someone he trusted outside the department. Rachel, a former forensic analyst turned private investigator, owed him a few favors from their days working cases together. He met her at a quiet diner on the edge of town, inhaler tucked safely in his jacket pocket. "So, what's got you all twisted up?" Rachel asked, sipping her coffee as she leaned back in the booth. Daniels pulled out the inhaler and set it on the table between them. "I need you to tell me if there's anything unusual about this." Rachel raised an eyebrow, picking up the device and turning it over in her hands. "Looks like a standard inhaler," she said at first, but then her expression changed. "Wait, these markings. This isn't normal." She pulled out a small flashlight from her bag and examined the scratches more closely. "It's been modified. I bet good money there's something inside this that doesn't belong." Daniels' heart sank. "Can you find out what it is?" Rachel nodded. "Give me a couple of days. But if this is what I think it is, you might want to be careful. People don't mess with medical devices unless they're hiding something big." Daniels left the diner with a mix of relief and dread. He was closer to uncovering the truth, but the deeper he went, the more dangerous it seemed. As he got into his car, his phone buzzed again. Another blocked number. He didn't answer this time, but the message was clear. He was being watched. The stakes were rising, and Daniels knew he had crossed the line. Whatever he was dealing with, it wasn't just about an elderly woman or her son anymore. It was about power, secrets, and a web of danger that was quickly closing in around him. And as much as he wanted to walk away, he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. The next 2 days passed in a blur for Daniels. He kept his routine as normal as possible, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he stepped outside, every car that lingered too long at a stop sign, every unfamiliar face in the precinct, it all felt like a potential threat. He had spent years on the force learning to trust his instincts, and now they were screaming at him that something was coming. Rachel finally called him late in the evening, her turn urgent. "Daniels, you need to see this. Now." They met again at the same diner, though this time Rachel's usually calm demeanor was replaced by unease. She slid a small file across the table to him and leaned in close. "The inhaler, it's not just modified. There's a hidden compartment inside. Whatever was in there, it's gone now, but the residue left behind, it's bad news." Daniels frowned as he opened the file, scanning the lab results. The substance she'd identified wasn't something he recognized immediately, but her notes made it clear. It was a high-grade chemical compound, often used in black market dealings. What for exactly wasn't clear, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. "This isn't just some street-level operation," Rachel said, lowering her voice. "This kind of thing points to serious players, organized, well-funded. And if they went through the trouble of hiding it in something as innocuous as an inhaler, they're not going to let it slide that's missing." Daniels leaned back, the weight of her words settling in. It explained the cryptic warning from the woman, the strange man at the park, and the blocked calls. He had stumbled into a game where he didn't even know the rules, let alone the players. "What about the woman? Could this have anything to do with her son?" Daniels asked. his voice tight. Rachel hesitated, then nodded. I ran a background check based on the description you gave me. It took some digging, but I think I found her. Her name's Eleanor Hayes. Widowed, lives alone, but her son. She paused, her expression growing darker. His name is Nathan Hayes, and you don't want to mess with him. Daniels's pulse quickened. He had heard that name before, whispered in hushed tones among his colleagues, and on news reports about corporate corruption and underground dealings. Nathan Hayes wasn't just anyone. He was a powerful figure, a man with connections that ran deep and dark. He wasn't the kind of person you crossed lightly. Eleanor must have been trying to warn me, Daniel said, piecing things together. She knew this involved him, that man at the park. He wasn't random. He was there for the inhaler. Rachel nodded, and if Nathan's involved, it's bigger than either of us imagined. Daniels left the diner more on edge than ever. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, one wrong step away from falling into something he couldn't climb out of. The warnings, the threats, even the feeling of being watched, it was all escalating. That night, as he sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a blocked number, but an unfamiliar one. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Daniels. You've been busy, the voice on the other end said, calm, but with an edge of menace. It wasn't the same voice from before, but it carried the same weight. You've made some dangerous choices. Daniels didn't respond immediately, waiting for the caller to reveal more. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you're protecting, it's not worth your life. Hand over the inhaler, and we'll forget this ever happened. Daniels gripped the phone tightly. I don't have it, he lied, his voice steady. The silence that followed was chilling. You're lying, officer. That's a mistake you don't want to make. Before Daniels could respond, the line went dead. He sat there, his mind racing. They were getting closer, and now they knew he was actively involved. His lie might have bought him time, but it wouldn't last long. The next day, Daniels decided it was time to confront Eleanor. She was the only one who might be able to give him the answers he needed. Tracking her down wasn't difficult. Her address was in the background check Rachel had pulled. It was a modest house on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. As he approached the front door, Daniels noticed how eerily still everything was. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of movement inside. He knocked, but there was no response. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Instinctively, Daniels reached for the doorknob, finding it unlocked. He pushed the door open cautiously, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. The house was dark, the only light coming from a faint glow in the living room. Eleanor, he called out, his voice firm, but not loud. There was no answer, only the creak of the floorboards beneath his feet as he stepped inside. The living room was in disarray, papers scattered, furniture slightly askew. It didn't look like a full-blown break-in, but something was off. On the coffee table, a photograph caught his eye. It was Eleanor, younger and smiling, with a boy who must have been Nathan. Daniels picked it up, studying their faces. The warmth in the photo was a stark contrast to the cold reality surrounding it now. A noise from the back of the house made him freeze. It was faint, like a door closing softly. Daniels set the photo down and moved toward the hallway, his steps careful and deliberate. Eleanor, it's Officer Daniels, he said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry. As he reached the end of the hall, a figure stepped into view. It wasn't Eleanor. It was a man, tall and broad, dressed in dark clothing. His face was partially obscured, but his posture was menacing. You shouldn't have come here, the man said, his voice low and filled with warning. Daniels felt his adrenaline spike, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon. Where's Eleanor? He demanded. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. You're in over your head, officer. Walk away while you still can. But Daniels didn't back down. Not until I know she's safe. Where is she? The man smirked, a cold, calculated expression. She's beyond your help now. But if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions. Nathan doesn't forgive mistakes. Daniel's mind raced. Eleanor was missing. The inhaler was a key piece in a larger puzzle. And now he was face to face with someone who clearly wasn't afraid to act on Nathan Hayes' behalf. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken threats. As the man stepped closer, Daniels knew the confrontation was far from over, and that he was hurtling toward a dangerous climax that could change everything. Daniels' heart pounded as he stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the man blocking his path. The stranger's smirk didn't waver, and his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniels knew he had to tread carefully, but his instincts told him this man wasn't here to negotiate. "You're wasting your time," the man said, his voice calm, but laced with threat. "Eleanor isn't your concern anymore. You're chasing a ghost." Daniels narrowed his eyes, trying to mask the unease creeping into his chest. "If she's not my concern, why are you here?" He shot back. "People don't send someone like you unless there's something worth hiding." The man tilted his head slightly, his smirk fading. For a moment, the silence between them felt like a standoff, each sizing the other up. Finally, the man let out a low chuckle, stepping aside as if to invite Daniels further into the house. "Since you're so determined, go ahead," he said, gesturing toward the hallway behind him. "See for yourself what you're really dealing with." Daniels hesitated, his gut warning him that this was a trap. But he couldn't back down now, not when the stakes were this high. Slowly, he moved past the man, his hand brushing against the holster of his weapon, ready for anything. The hallway led to a room at the back of the house. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled through the crack. Daniels pushed it open cautiously, his breath catching at what he saw. The room was sparse, but on the floor, a large map was spread out, covered with pins and scribbled notes. Photographs were taped to the walls, some of Eleanor, some of Nathan, and others of people Daniels didn't recognize. But what caught his attention most was the cluster of images and documents centered around one face, his own. Daniels stepped closer, his stomach twisting. There were surveillance photos of him taken from various locations, at the precinct, at the diner with Rachel, even outside his apartment. Notes were scrawled in a language he didn't immediately recognize, but the implication was clear. He wasn't just caught up in this, he was a target. "You've got their attention," the man said from the doorway, his tone almost amused. "Not many people can say that." Daniels turned to face him, his voice hard. "Why? What do they want from me?" The man shrugged, leaning casually against the doorframe. "It's not about what they want. It's about what you have. That inhaler, what was inside it, wasn't just valuable. It was dangerous. Nathan doesn't tolerate loose ends, and right now, you're the biggest one." Daniels clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a straightforward case of law and order. This was a web of power, secrets, and manipulation, and he was caught in the center of it. As he stepped away from the map, something else caught his eye. A laptop sitting on a small desk in the corner of the room. Its screen was on, displaying a series of encrypted messages. Daniels recognized the name at the top of one of the threads, Nathan Hayes. Before he could think better of it, Daniels moved toward the laptop. The man in the doorway straightened, his relaxed posture vanishing. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," he warned. But Daniels ignored him, his curiosity outweighing his caution. He tapped the trackpad, and the screen revealed a partially open document. The title alone made his blood run cold. *** Project Reverence. Confidential Directive ***. The document detailed what appeared to be a covert operation, though its purpose was obscured by jargon and redacted lines. What stood out were the references to high-profile individuals, politicians, corporate leaders, and even law enforcement officials, connected to Nathan Hayes' organization. This wasn't just about smuggling chemicals or laundering money. This was something bigger, something systemic. Daniels barely had time to process the implications before the man lunged forward, slamming the laptop shut. "You've seen enough," he growled, his demeanor shifting from smug to threatening. Daniels stepped back, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. "You just confirmed what I needed to know," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The man glared at him, but before he could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside broke the tension. Both men turned toward the window as the unmistakable glare of headlights filled the room. "They're here," the man muttered, his voice suddenly tense. Daniels didn't need to ask who they were. He moved toward the window, peering out to see two black SUVs pulling up in front of the house. Men in suits poured out, their movements precise and coordinated. These weren't random thugs, they were professionals. The man grabbed Daniels by the arm, his earlier hostility replaced by urgency. "You need to leave. Now?" Daniels yanked his arm free, glaring at him. "You were just about to stop me. Why the change of heart?" The man's jaw tightened. "Because if they find you here, it won't matter how many questions you have. You won't live long enough to get answers." Daniels hesitated for a fraction of a second before the sound of footsteps on the porch snapped him into action. He turned and bolted toward the back door, his mind racing. He didn't trust the man, but he trusted the danger outside even less. As he slipped into the shadows behind the house, he heard voices inside, calm, controlled, and chillingly direct. Wherever they weren't here to negotiate. Daniels ran, his breaths coming in short bursts as he disappeared into the darkness. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and the house. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and fear, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. The stakes had just been raised, and Daniels was no longer sure who he could trust, or how far Nathan Hayes' reach truly extended. Daniels' lungs burned as he sprinted through the quiet neighborhood, his thoughts a chaotic blur. Every shadow felt like it could conceal a threat, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the night. He had no plan, no clear direction, just a desperate need to stay ahead of whoever had descended on Eleanor's house. He ducked into an alley, pressing his back against the cool brick wall to catch his breath. His mind replayed the scene in the room, the map, the photographs, the encrypted messages, and the cryptic references to Project Reverence. It was all connected, but the puzzle still felt incomplete. The inhaler was at the center of it, a catalyst for something much larger, but Daniels couldn't figure out why. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. The number was blocked again. This time, he hesitated before answering. "You're running out of time," the voice on the other end said, calm and controlled. "Nathan doesn't leave loose ends, officer. You should know that by now." Daniels tightened his grip on the phone, his jaw clenching. "If you think I'm just going to disappear, you don't know me," he shot back. The voice chuckled softly. "No, Daniels, I think we know you better than you know yourself. That's why you're still alive." Before Daniels could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, the weight of those words sinking in. They weren't just tracking him. They were toying with him, pushing him towards something he couldn't see yet. He needed help, and there was only one person he trusted. He called Rachel, his voice urgent as he explained what had happened at Eleanor's house. She didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the lab," she said. "There's something you need to see." Daniels made his way to Rachel's lab under the cover of darkness, his every step fueled by a mix of determination and dread. When he arrived, she was waiting for him, her face tense but resolute. "I analyzed the residue from the inhaler again," she said, leading him to a table covered in equipment and papers. "It's not just a chemical compound. It's a prototype, a weaponized substance designed for targeted attacks. The kind of thing that could be devastating if it fell into the wrong hands." Daniels stared at her, the pieces finally starting to click. The inhaler wasn't just a vessel for smuggling. It was a test, a proof of concept for something far more dangerous. "Nathan Hayes isn't just running an operation," Daniels said, his voice low. "He's planning something big." Rachel nodded, her expression grim. And whatever it is, that inhaler was just the beginning. Before they could say more, the sound of tires screeching outside made them both freeze. Daniels moved to the window, peering out to see a black SUV pulling up to the lab. "They've found us," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Daniels grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back exit. "We need to get out of here," he said. They slipped out just as the front door burst open, voices shouting commands. Daniels led Rachel through a maze of alleyways, his mind racing. They couldn't keep running forever, and he knew they needed to confront this head-on. As they reached a safe distance, Rachel stopped, her face pale. "Daniels, there's something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" She hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a second inhaler. This wasn't the only one, she admitted. "I found this at the lab earlier tonight. I think it's a backup, but I didn't know what to do with it." Daniels stared at the inhaler in her hand, the weight of her revelation hitting him like a punch to the gut. They were back where they started, but this time they had a chance to change the game. Before they could decide their next move, another voice cut through the darkness. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Daniels spun around, his hand going to his weapon. Standing a few feet away was Nathan Hayes himself, flanked by two menacing bodyguards. Nathan's presence was magnetic, his calm demeanor exuding confidence and control. He looked at Daniels and Rachel with an almost amused expression. "You've been very persistent, officer," he said. "I'll give you credit for that." Daniels stepped forward, his jaw tight. "This ends now," he said. "Whatever you're planning, it's over." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't understand, do you? This was never about the inhaler or even the substance inside. This was about control, testing the limits of how far people will go to protect their secrets." Daniel's stomach dropped as Nathan's words sank in. This wasn't just a criminal operation. It was a calculated move to expose weaknesses, to exploit fear and loyalty. Nathan gestured to the inhaler in Rachel's hand. "That's the last piece of the puzzle," he said. "Hand it over, and this can all end quietly." But Daniels wasn't about to back down. "And if we don't?" he challenged. Nathan's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard expression. "Then you'll learn why people don't cross me." For a moment, the standoff felt like it could go either way. But then, from the shadows, a new figure emerged, Eleanor. Her appearance was disheveled, but her eyes burned with determination. She stepped between Nathan and Daniels, her voice trembling but strong. "This ends now," she said, her gaze locked on her son. Nathan's expression faltered for the first time, a flicker of something almost like fear crossing his face. "Mother, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted. "You've gone too far, Nathan. It's time to face the consequences." Eleanor turned to Daniels, her voice firm. "Do what you have to do, officer." In that moment, Daniels knew he had the upper hand. With Eleanor's testimony and the evidence they had gathered, Nathan's empire would crumble. But as he moved to act, a final twist revealed itself. Nathan's bodyguards didn't move to protect him. Instead, they turned and walked away, leaving him exposed and alone. Nathan's confidence shattered as the realization hit him. His own men had betrayed him, likely orchestrated by someone even higher up in the chain of power. As the authorities arrived to take Nathan into custody, Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Nathan Hayes might be out of the picture, but the forces behind him were still in play, watching, waiting. And as Daniels and Rachel stood in the aftermath, Eleanor quietly disappeared into the night, leaving them with one final question. Was she truly on their side, or had she just played her own hand in a much larger game? As the police cars pulled away, their flashing lights casting a fading glow against the night sky, Daniels stood still, watching Nathan Hayes disappear into the back of one of the vehicles. The air felt heavier now, not with fear or adrenaline, but with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Rachel stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly against the cold, her face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I can't believe it's over," she said softly, breaking the silence. Daniels glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Is it though? He replied, his voice low. She turned to him, her expression questioning. Nathan's in custody. The evidence we've gathered, it's more than enough to dismantle everything he's built. Daniels shook his head. Nathan's just a piece of this. He was powerful, sure, but the way his own men turned on him, it means there's someone bigger pulling the strings. This doesn't end with him. Rachel looked down, her shoulders slumping. So what now? Do we keep digging? Keep running? Daniels sighed, his breath visible in the chilly air. No, he said firmly. We've done what we can for now. Nathan's capture will send shockwaves through his network. It'll force the people behind him to scramble, to cover their tracks. That gives us time to regroup. Rachel nodded, but her unease was clear. And Eleanor? Where does she fit into all of this? Daniels didn't have an answer. Eleanor's role in everything remained a mystery. She had stepped in at the critical moment, but her disappearance felt too deliberate to be innocent. Was she a pawn in this game, or was she playing it herself? As they stood there, the faint sound of a car starting up reached their ears. Daniels turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to his weapon, but the source was already retreating. Across the street, Eleanor's silhouette was barely visible in the driver's seat of an old sedan. She didn't look back as she drove away. Daniels let out a slow breath, lowering his hand. She's gone, he said simply. Rachel stepped closer, her voice cautious. Do you think we'll ever see her again? I don't know, Daniels admitted. But I don't think we've seen the last of her story. The following days were a blur of debriefings, reports, and media frenzy. Nathan Hayes' arrest was front-page news, his empire's downfall a spectacle that captivated the public. But the details of Project Reverence remained classified, sealed away by authorities who didn't want the full extent of the truth exposed. Daniels found himself frustrated by the bureaucracy, the way the system seemed more interested in containment than justice. But he also understood the stakes. The knowledge of what that inhaler represented, what it could do, was too dangerous to be widely known. Rachel, meanwhile, returned to her work at the lab, though the events had left her deeply shaken. She confided in Daniels one evening over coffee, her voice trembling as she admitted, I'm scared, Daniels. If they could do something like this once, what's stopping them from trying again? Daniels reached across the table, his hand resting on hers. We stopped them this time, he said, and we'll be ready if they try again. Our eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of their shared experience seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet understanding. They weren't alone in this fight, and that made all the difference. But the question of Eleanor lingered in Daniel's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. She had known too much, acted too decisively. He began to dig quietly, using whatever resources he could to piece together her past. What he found only deepened the mystery. Eleanor Hayes had lived a quiet life for decades, her record spotless. But before that, she had been involved in humanitarian work overseas, operating in regions known for instability and conflict. There were gaps in her timeline, years where no official records existed. But whispers of her involvement in covert operations surfaced in old, declassified documents. Daniels sat back in his chair, staring at the scattered papers on his desk. Who was Eleanor Hayes? And what was her real role in all of this? As he pondered the question, his phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Sometimes the best way to win is to let others think they've won. Keep your eyes open, officer. There was no signature, but Daniels didn't need one. He knew it was from Eleanor. The message left him with more questions than answers, but it also gave him a sense of clarity. The game wasn't over, and Eleanor was still playing her part. Whether she was an ally or a wild card remained to be seen. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle back into a semblance of normalcy. The case was officially closed, though Daniels knew better than to believe it was truly over. He threw himself into his work, determined to stay vigilant, to be ready for whatever came next. Rachel continued her research, focusing on projects that could make a positive difference in the world. Her experiences had shaken her, but they had also strengthened her resolve. She and Daniels kept in touch, their bond forged by the trials they had faced together. One evening, as Daniels walked home from the precinct, he stopped by a small park. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the city. He sat on a bench, watching as children played and couples strolled by. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The fight wasn't over, but he had learned to appreciate the quiet moments when they came. As he sat there, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. It was Eleanor, her steps slow and deliberate as she approached. She sat down beside him without a word, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You're not easy to track down," Daniel said, breaking the silence. Eleanor smiled faintly. "I could say the same about you," she replied. It sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Finally, Daniels turned to her. "Why did you do it? Step in like that, then disappear." Eleanor's expression softened, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Because sometimes the only way to protect what matters is to make sacrifices," she said. "Nathan lost his way, but I couldn't let him drag others down with him." Daniels studied her, searching for any hint of deception. "And what about you? What's your next move?" Eleanor stood, her posture graceful and confident. "That depends on what happens next," she said. "But if you ever need me, you'll know where to look." She walked away without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Daniels watched her go, a mix of admiration and frustration swirling within him. Eleanor Hayes remained an enigma. But one thing was clear. Her story wasn't over, and neither was his. As the city lights began to flicker on, Daniels rose from the bench, a renewed sense of purpose driving him forward. The fight for justice was far from easy, but he was ready to face whatever came next.